Hi everybody, welcome to Communication and Conflict, promoting mindful communication, growth through conflict. And today's video, as often the case, will also be a podcast available on anchor.fm and as an Apple podcast under the name CAOS, C-A-O-S. So today I want to talk about the use of mediation in complaints work. There are three particular areas in which I've provided mediation in complaints work in the past, so I'm going to focus more on those, but I do also want to talk a little bit more generically about how mediation can be useful in complaints work in areas beyond just the three that I've worked in. So the three areas of complaints work that I've worked in are special educational needs mediation, so disagreements about the provision of special education for children with special educational needs, so complaints made by parents to the local authority or perhaps to the school in which the young person is being educated. NHS complaints, so complaints made by patients and sometimes relatives of patients, particularly where a patient has died, about different practitioners. And I worked mainly in the primary care sector, so that will be about doctors, dentists, opticians, and other primary care workers. And thirdly, university student complaints. So that's an area I've already covered a little bit when I looked at the use of mediation within universities, but I'm going to say a bit more about that today. Possibly, I think, go into a bit more detail about that today. So those are the three main areas I'm going to talk about. But as I say, I also want to kind of talk quite generically about the use of complaints, use of mediation for complaints, because I think there are many circumstances where it can be very useful, and as is often the case, it's perhaps not used as frequently as it could be. And it's very much the kind of situation where a complaint kind of isn't going away, and it's basically because there isn't a satisfactory, the person making the complaint doesn't feel satisfied and does continuously find reasons to continue with the complaint. And obviously sometimes what that leads to is a sense that this person's a serial complainer, which is a very common phrase that I used to hear providing mediation in complaints. But actually, in my experience, it was generally that it was just someone who didn't feel listened to. But as with all these things, you can't kind of generalize. Sometimes perhaps it is someone who's just, perhaps enjoys the experience of making complaints, but generally with the people I worked with, that wasn't the case. It was just coming down to the fact they just didn't feel listened to. And I think there are areas about how complaints are handled sometimes that can make that a very likely experience, but not always. I don't want this to be a kind of a knocking complaints processes video, because obviously a lot of complaints workers do a very, very good job in meeting the concerns of the people who make complaints. But as I say, mediation as a process is particularly relevant to situations which perhaps can't be fully resolved by a process, because there's something about it that doesn't quite fit within what the complaints procedure is designed to deal with and to resolve. So let's start with special educational needs mediation. Now, I'll say up front, I haven't done that for a few years now, and I'm very aware that since I stopped doing it, there have been some quite significant changes in the way that mediation is offered and managed in the present day way of dealing with special educational needs. And I'm talking about in the UK, although apparently it hasn't come in Northern Ireland yet, but for the rest of the UK, as far as I understand it, there's a different kind of way of managing mediation within special educational needs complaints, or disagreements as they used to be called. But So I'm not going to try to go into that detail because A, I don't know enough about it, but B, when I have ever looked into it, it's without question, apart from perhaps divorce mediation, it is probably the most complicated and off-putting legislation I've ever seen in relation to mediation, and I'd be surprised if many people do actually use it, and even if they do, I'd be surprised if it does help them reach a resolution. But I'm not saying it's impossible, but it seems to be such a minefield that I'd be surprised if many people do actually make it through to the other side. But however complicated or simple the process is, the original purpose when I was providing mediation within it was simply to enable a useful discussion between the parents who had concerns about whether their child's special educational needs were being met by both the school usually at which they attended, but also by the local authority which was required to fund the provision of that special education for their child. So mediations could be between parents and obviously carers or parents, and the local authority, because often it would come down to whether there was agreement over whether there was funding for the necessary funding for the needs, or sometimes it would include the school as well. But often, because of how the funding situation works, it would be between the parents and the local authority or representatives, because the local authority would have assessed the needs of the child through educational psychologists and other assessors, and would then fund the educational support for the child, and there would often therefore be disagreements between the parents and the outcomes of the assessments as to whether that the provision made met the needs of the child. So there would be a complaint raised or a concern. If it wasn't resolved quickly, then it had the option of going to mediation, and so that meant that the parents would sit with the representatives from the local authority. Sometimes an educational psychologist would also be present, and often what would happen would be that the parents would present evidence as they saw it that certain things were either not meeting the child's needs, or they felt that there was a kind of an underassessment, a kind of a lesser assessment of what the child was capable of, and so the correct needs weren't in place to kind of help the child to thrive. And so sometimes what it would lead to would be a further or reassessment of the child based on things that the parents brought or said they'd witnessed, which had been assessed as not being present in the child. So maybe some kind of capacity to do something, or possibly even an incapacity to do something. But the parents would kind of question the assessments, basically, both of what the child was capable of, but also whether the provision was put in place for the child to have their needs met. Hope that will make sense. And so basically the discussion would be between the parents and the representatives, and they were actually often quite cooperative. They were pretty useful. There was a pretty kind of shared focus on the needs of the child, and there was a kind of an openness to reconsidering different assessments, and therefore reconsidering what used to be called the statement of the child's educational needs, special educational needs. And so in those kind of contexts, there was often quite a successful, useful, constructive discussion, and changes happened subsequently. Whether it was always fully to the satisfaction of the parents may not have always been, but then again there was also the question of whether the local authority had as much resources as they might have wanted to meet the child's needs, and obviously there has to be a balance over the two. But certainly there was often a change in the direction that the parents wanted, and obviously that's a good sign because it's meant that they've been able to address things directly with the local authority. So that in itself is useful because they're able to develop a good relationship with the local authority about taking things forward, rather than being kind of constant disagreement and unresolved conflict with them. So there are many bonuses to it. The needs of the child were met, and also it established a more productive relationship between the parents and the local authority. The situations which tended not to be as likely to come to a resolution was where it was very simply down to which school or site that the child went to be educated. There would sometimes be differences of opinion as to whether a school that the child went to did meet the needs as the parents saw it, and they would identify a different school that they felt would more effectively meet the child's needs. But sometimes for reasons of simply where the school was located, perhaps it was in another county or another area, and so that added additional costs for the local authority. Sometimes it was that the school itself was perhaps too expensive in the eyes of the local authority. And while there's obviously a requirement on the local authority to meet the child's needs, they do also have a certain kind of level of how can I put it, kind of balance to be struck with regard to whether they can actually meet fully the child's needs or do their best to meet the child's needs. And sometimes obviously doing their best just simply meant they could only afford to send the child to a particular school. But I mean, some of those got resolved, but often it would be that the local authority kind of very much stuck with the school that they identified, and it may then have gone to further stages such as legal action by the parents, but also sometimes they may have accepted the school given. But it could have also sometimes been, the mediation could also sometimes been an opportunity for the parents to be reassured about what the school could do. And if they were reassured, then obviously that helped things. But sometimes that wasn't possible, so it didn't get as fully resolved as people might have wanted. So that's how mediation was used when I was involved. Those were the kinds of situations that I was facilitating. And as always, I'd have separate meetings with people beforehand, maybe a week or two beforehand, talk through with them what it is they were wanting from the process, what might be possible if they didn't get that, what might be possible if there wasn't actually a joint meeting, etc., etc., continuously seeking to support people in creating a better way forward. And so that's the way in which mediation worked in that kind of complaint. It struck me earlier actually that in a sense there is a kind of a fourth area that I provided mediation, which I would almost align with that, which a long time ago was disability discrimination complaints. And in some ways nowadays I think those concerns are merged with the special educational needs disputes, because obviously special educational needs can also include the physical needs of the child in being able to access education. So there were issues around disability that were also possible to have mediation. Yeah, I won't say any more about that, but that was an example. So the next one that I mentioned was, I can't remember if this is the order in which I said it, but the next one that I was going to look at was NHS complaints. So that was in relation to complaints made by patients about primary care practitioners, so doctors, dentists, opticians, sometimes different primary care practitioners. So that would be situations, for example, where a patient had a difficult relationship with the practitioner. Maybe they'd had an argument. Sometimes it would be that they'd had an argument with the receptionist over arranging appointments, or maybe about getting their medication, and there would be a falling out. Sometimes it was to do with issues around mental health. In some situations it would be mediation between relatives of somebody who's passed away, and they had concerns about the treatment given to the relative who's passed away, and so they would raise a complaint, and the mediation would often be an opportunity for the the doctor, the doctor, to kind of go through the different treatments given to the relative, to try to explain to the concerned relatives what was done and why. And obviously various issues come in to that, because obviously people are feeling very upset after a relative has died. Sometimes they weren't around when it happened. They may have lived some distance away and then only kind of heard about the treatment, so they had concerns. So it's a chance for the relatives of the patient and the primary care practitioner to have a discussion about the treatment, and for them to raise any questions or concerns, etc. But as I say, also there were times when it was about the relationship breaking down with a practitioner or a receptionist. Receptionist, as I said, over things like getting appointments or arranging to receive medication if it was a kind of a regular prescription. And with practitioners, it might have been just how they spoke to each other, really, whether it was felt to be respectful or not. Just as a kind of an observation of what can happen in doctor-patient relationships, is that sometimes there can be a kind of a projection of absolute knowledge onto a doctor, as if, the second a treatment doesn't work, then it must mean the doctor's failed in some way, whereas often, doctors have to try different treatments before they can really come down on the one that works best. And so kind of that fear and worry that comes into a patient if their doctor's prescription hasn't kind of worked for them. But there is a kind of counter side to that, in that sometimes doctors don't acknowledge that fallibility that they might have about not always immediately getting the prescription right. And so in a sense, when you get those two ends of the spectrum, there can be very insecure relationships or difficulties within that relationship because of the kind of mutual expectations that happen, and so that can lead to a difficulty. So that was a particular example, or not a particular example, but that was a kind of quite a common dynamic. And you can understand the experiences on both sides. The doctor's under a lot of pressure to get things right for people. Patients are very worried and anxious about what's going on for them. So it's understandable that those kinds of emotions can lead to breakdowns in relationships. And obviously the beauty of mediation is that it's not making it a formal thing about how things got dealt with. It's making it a kind of an informal, supported discussion, which allows for a kind of a reconnection between the practitioner and the patient. I'll quickly try to do an example case that really showed how mediation can save so much time and stress for both patient and practitioner. It was the very first one I ever did when I was an NHS complaints mediator, and I'd come from kind of doing neighbour disputes previously, and so it's a different context in which I was providing it. But the first case I got was, I was given a file, and it was literally kind of an inch thick. And I don't normally read files on complaints because I'm there not to analyse it. I'm there to facilitate a discussion, because the people involved know much more about their situation than I do, and always will. So I'm there to facilitate their discussion, not read it and analyse the problem. Particularly over things like medical issues, because I'm never going to understand it better than the doctor does, and I'm never going to experience it better than the patient does. But nevertheless, I was given a kind of a file about an inch thick, and what it was over was one treatment of a dental patient, and they wanted to not have to have a tooth taken out. They wanted to see if it was possible for the dentist to do kind of more finer detailed work on their tooth rather than have the tooth taken out. And the dentist said, well, in order for that to be possible, we'll have to anaesthetise you. You'll have to be kind of, knocked out, basically, not physically, but by drugs. Excuse me. And so the aim was that under anaesthetic, the dentist will be able to do the kind of final work that would prevent the need to have the tooth just completely taken out. But unfortunately, what happened was when the patient was under anaesthetic, they did still move around a lot, because apparently some patients do still move around a lot even when they're anaesthetised. So the dentist did eventually have to take the tooth out, because if they were going to do the work at all, they had to take that opportunity, that time, to remove the tooth. So when the patient woke up and found the tooth had been removed, they were very unhappy, because they thought the whole point of being anaesthetised was to prevent that. So they made a complaint, and unfortunately what it showed was how the second such complaints happen and other bodies get involved to represent the two parties. So on the one side at the time, and this will tell some people how long ago this was, on the one side at the time, the Community Health Council was advocating and representing the patient, and the Medical Defence Union was supporting and representing the dentist. And there was just a whole kind of relay system of letters going backwards and forwards over this one treatment, and this was why this file was that thick, over simply this one treatment that had occurred. And within the responses from the dentist, their response was to say that the reason the tooth had to be taken out was because the patient was described as disruptive under anaesthetic. And by disruptive, obviously the dentist meant that they moved around, and they were advised to use that phraseology because it was deemed to be the appropriate language to describe it, kind of medically or otherwise. And the patient, obviously, understandably, took that to mean that somehow they were being kind of awkward or difficult or mischievous or whatever by disruptive. And this meant that there was this kind of constant locking of horns backwards and forwards. And to cut the long story short, they did agree to come to a mediation meeting, and it literally only took about 45 minutes for the dentist to do some diagrams, to explain what had happened, why it had happened, to apologise that it hadn't been the outcome that the patient had wanted, which they weren't able to do in letters because it would have risked being seen as kind of acknowledging some kind of malpractice or whatever, which it wasn't, because it was just simply a necessary decision to be made at the time. And it literally took about 45 minutes to an hour for the dentist to explain what had happened, and the patient was satisfied. They'd had their apology. They couldn't do anything about the tooth. They understood now more about why it had happened, that it wasn't meant rudely to say that they were disruptive, and it was resolved. And this was in an hour in a mediation, and yet it had been going on for about a year, backwards and forwards, with complaints by letter going backwards and forwards. So just that hopefully just kind of indicates the kind of point about mediation, is that it can save so much time and stress, and re-establish relationships, and help there to be understanding, help there to be connection between people, and so much a better way of dealing with things than getting stuck in all this kind of bureaucracy of writing complaints letters backwards and forwards that get nowhere, because no one's actually done anything wrong. Everybody's done their best, but sometimes things don't work out as is hoped. So that was an example of an NHS complaint that I provided mediation for, and we're talking, that was actually now about 20 years ago. But I give that example simply because it shows how much time and effort and hassle it can save in situations. I think, I've probably covered NHS complaints with that one. So the next one that I'll talk about is which I've had experience of, was quite a lot of experience of this kind of thing actually. University student complaints. So I've done quite a lot of mediation for various universities in the London area, both central and more kind of on the outside complaints work. And these are complaints made by students, again, about a whole range of things. So it could be a PhD student having concerns about their supervision and the relationship breakdown with their supervisor, and that obviously being a concern, and maybe not something that can be resolved through a formal process, because it would in a sense break down the relationship between them, and obviously they would want there to be an ongoing relationship, but perhaps on a different understanding. It might be between not necessarily PhD but a postgraduate, maybe an MA student who has a falling out with a lecturer in one situation because perhaps they felt they were being spoken to as a young person, but they wanted respect for being someone who was an adult, an older person who had, lived a life of various experience and was doing an MA or MSc, whichever it was, as a kind of a further development in things that they wanted to do in life, and didn't feel that they were spoken to with necessary respect by lecturers, etc., and things falling out, and then feeling that that was having an impact on their course marks and coursework. So that kind of thing. So relationship breakdowns between staff and students. Mediations over access to courses. So once somebody who had a range of physical disability and other challenges being assessed as not suitable for a particular course that they really wanted to do, and objecting to their rejection on a course. So it was a module within a course they were doing, and objecting to not being allowed to take it on the basis of the assessment because they felt they could do it. But in the end, what they did was they did actually find a different course which was just as satisfactory to the person, but which didn't require the particular physical capacities that the other course needed, that it was felt weren't possible for the person to achieve, I suppose is the right word. And so mediation over that. So a discussion between the course providers and the student, and in that situation there was also an advocate there to help the person express themselves when needed, although actually 90% of the time the person expressed themselves directly, which is an important thing in mediation. And so that kind of challenge in university student complaints. Lots of others, to be honest. Sometimes concerns about the nature of content within a course, and whether it's felt to be kind of representative of different groups, and discussions around that. Possibly kind of non-academic issues around perhaps involvement in groups that are run within universities, and difficulties between staff and students over those things. So again, with all of these things, the point being that taking a formal complaints route is very rarely going to resolve these kinds of difficulties, because they're more about the relationships between people involved. But that doesn't mean they can be dismissed, because people have still got to kind of work together. So using a formal process is very unlikely to lead to any kind of help in such situations. So it's got to be about people being given a chance to work things out together, and that's where mediation comes in and supports that kind of possibility. So those are the three areas that I've mainly worked in, and hopefully that gives you a taste of the kinds of things that mediation can help to provide support for. But as I said, I kind of want to talk a little bit generally about use of mediation in complaints, because there are many examples where complaints procedures have become very much kind of system-led, and it's almost as if the person who makes the complaint, kind of once they've made the complaint, they're almost left out of the whole thing, and the system continues, and at the end people are kind of given an outcome and they don't feel very engaged. Whereas from the point of view of the complaints officers, and sometimes those complaints officers are being overseen by outside kind of monitoring bodies as well, they've done everything they needed to do, so they've done what they needed to do, and rightly so, and no criticism of them for doing that. But the experience of the person making the complaint is that they've not really felt listened to, because in a sense they might have submitted their complaint, but then that's the end of it until they get told at the end, this is what we've decided, this is the outcome, here's that outcome, your complaint is now resolved. And people can feel, well, you didn't ask me whether it's resolved or not. And often what that means is people then reopen their complaint. And so while from the system side of things it looks like it's resolved, they've done all the necessary things, the system may have been developed based on kind of external requirements, legal requirements, etc., etc. But it's very much taken out of the hands of the complainants. There's very little engagement with the complainant. And as I say, I don't want to sound like I'm saying it's wrong or right about this. I'm just saying this is what can happen in some situations, is that there's so much focus on establishing a system that is designed to fit all the external requirements for what that system is meant to provide, that actually the complainant kind of gets filtered out of that. And so while the organisation is doing all it needs to do to satisfy the external requirements, it doesn't actually fulfil what a lot of people are looking for when they complain, which is to have their concerns listened to, engaged with, discussed, and therefore feel that as though they've kind of been a part of coming to that end point. And so those are the kinds of situations where people, if they do kind of keep reopening the complaint, where mediation is going to be very much useful, because it's going to enable that sense of being listened to, that sense of creating the outcome together, and that therefore they will feel that they've kind of been a part of moving things forward, and sometimes in a way that then means it's a change for other people. But I think that kind of systematizing does risk people feeling very dissatisfied with the outcome of complaints, even if the system would say we've resolved it. And I think I mentioned in the video I did about apologies, and their significance and what people want from an apology, was that I had a discussion once with someone talking about NHS complaints, and they were telling me how there was a kind of an initiative brought in where, because it was understood that people often are looking for an apology when they make an NHS complaint, they were standardising saying sorry in their letters to people, as if in a sense without even knowing what it's saying sorry for, because it's a standard letter, so it's not specifically responding to an individual complaint, as if that's going to satisfy the need for an apology for people. Whereas really the whole point of an apology is it needs to be spontaneous, unique to the situation, and felt to be genuine. So kind of putting it in a standard letter kind of misses the point of an apology. But that's the kind of thing about where sometimes the responses to complaints can become standardized, and therefore people feel dissatisfied, and that's where they will keep coming back because they want to feel heard. And that's sometimes where mediation then can be very, very useful for people, because they're able to have a direct engagement with the people who are dealing with their complaint and share what their concerns are with them. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Hope that's been useful and interesting. As I say, I spoke about special educational needs, mediation, or mediation for that kind of context, NHS complaints, mainly around primary care providers and patients, and university student complaints, and then a little bit in general about those kinds of things. So I hope it's given you a kind of taste for how mediation can be useful in those situations, what's involved, etc., etc. Why I obviously think it's a very useful thing. for those situations which can't be kind of almost mechanistically responded to by the system. And there are many where it can. So I'm not saying that's wrong to do it that way. In many situations it is right and proper that just simply the mechanism of the complaints procedure is enough. But there are many situations where it's not enough because it doesn't give that sense of engagement and being listened to that people are looking for in a complaint. And so in those situations, mediation can be a very, very useful thing that prevents that kind of almost continuous kind of tiring kind of journey that never seems to get to an end point. And mediation can help people to come out of that, stop, create a resolution, and then it can genuinely come to an end. So thanks for listening. Hope you found it useful. Hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching as well, obviously on the YouTube channel. If you like it, please press the thumbs up button. If you'd like to hear more, please subscribe, both on the podcast and on YouTube channel. Please give it a rating if it's on the podcast. And if you did like it and you've lasted this far, then I hope to engage you with something else again in the future, and I hope that's of interest. And if you've got any preferred topics, if you've got any questions, please let me know in the comments bar below, or by contacting me through the podcast as well. And thanks very much for listening, and goodbye.